There's a lot of talk in the natural health and wellness world that the moon can cause us to ovulate twice in a single menstrual cycle. And you know what? This can be really scary for people to hear, especially when they're just starting out using a fertility awareness-based method to track their cycle for birth control. So, do we need to be worried about moon-induced double ovulations? Can we truly ovulate multiple times in a single menstrual cycle? Before I start, you should know that I love the moon. I walk outside at night and I talk to Mama Moon and I say thank you to her for her beautiful light. I also track the phases of the moon in my cycle charting journal. So you could say I'm a bit obsessed with the moon, but I also know that the moon is not going to force my ovaries to ovulate twice in a single menstrual cycle. So let's dive in. You may have heard people talk about something called the Natal Lunar Phase Return. Now, proponents of this theory believe that we've got two possible fertile phases in our menstrual cycle. They include, number one, the normal biological event of ovulation, which occurs approximately 2 weeks prior to your next period. So in a textbook 28-day cycle, that ovulation event is going to occur on cycle day 14. So that's the first one. And secondly, they believe there is a second ovulation, which occurs when the moon is in the same phase that it was in when you were born. So as an example, if you were born 2 days before a waning crescent moon, then you could always expect to be highly fertile 2 days before the waning crescent moon, regardless of where that might fall in your current menstrual cycle. This theory was created in 1956 by Doctor Eugen Jonas, a devout Catholic psychiatrist from Slovakia. So abortion had recently been legalized in neighboring Hungary, and being devoutly Catholic, Dr. Jonas wanted to find a way of reducing unintended pregnancies and therefore abortions. Back in 1950s Slovakia, Dr. Jonas would calculate in advance where these lunar fertile days would fall throughout the year. Dr. Jonas would then advise his patients to abstain from sex for at least 4 days around this time. Usually he would specify to avoid the 3 days leading up to the lunar fertile day and the lunar fertile day itself, as well as a full 13 days identified by a type of the rhythm method. Now, if you haven't heard of the rhythm method before, it basically involves counting days on a calendar to predict when you'll be fertile in your current cycle, assuming that will be the same as your past cycles. It's a very outdated form of birth control from the 1930s. It's only got low quality scientific studies to support it and has an estimated effectiveness rate of around 80%, which is generally unacceptable by today's standards. So with the 13 days of abstinence calculated with the rhythm method and the 4 days of abstinence for the lunar fertile days, Dr. Jonas's patients were abstaining for at least 17 days out of every menstrual cycle. Now, according to his website, Dr. Jonas's method is apparently 98.6% effective. However, I cannot find any evidence whatsoever of any scientific literature supporting his claims. And if you stop to think about it, it's hardly surprising that the effectiveness of the rhythm method is increased when users have to abstain for a total of 17 full days each menstrual cycle. Let's dive into the biology though, because it turns out that your body is actively stopping you from ovulating twice in one menstrual cycle. Here's how. Each menstrual cycle, we have groups of around 10 follicles that begin to grow in our ovaries as our period ends. A follicle is a fluid-filled sac that houses an egg. An egg is the largest cell in the human body, and it's actually visible with the naked eye. So it's around the size of a full stop or a period at the end of a sentence. Now, inside that egg are 23 chromosomes, which is half of the DNA required to make a new human being. Sperm carry the other 23 chromosomes. Out of this group of follicles, one follicle is eventually going to become dominant, and it will grow to around 2 centimeters in size. The other follicles are going to regress and die away. As that dominant follicle grows larger, it produces more and more estrogen. Eventually, peak estrogen levels in the bloodstream trigger your brain to release a surge of luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone causes that tiny egg to burst free of that now 2 centimeter diameter follicle. The egg is collected from your ovary by the fimbriae, which are waving finger-like projections at the end of your fallopian tube. Now, the follicle that's left behind in your ovary is transformed into a temporary gland called a corpus luteum. The corpus luteum produces large quantities of progesterone. Now, here's what you need to know. Progesterone has a negative feedback effect on the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland in the brain. So what does that really mean? Well, progesterone suppresses any further surges of luteinizing hormone. This means that no further eggs can be released because progesterone from the first ovulation prevents any further surges of luteinizing hormone. So a second ovulation cannot occur. This is the biological mechanism by which ovulation only happens once per menstrual cycle. And if you look behind me on this poster, you can actually see that whole process play out visually with the group of follicles growing, one of them becoming dominant and releasing an egg. During the growth process, there are high levels of estrogen, which triggers a surge of luteinizing hormone. The leftover follicle becomes a corpus luteum, producing beautiful quantities of progesterone, and it's this progesterone which prevents any further surge of luteinizing hormone.